So, what is an abolitionist anyway when it comes to public school? This is a question I get asked a lot because it's right there in my intro. Abolitionist at the end. The way I'm going to explain it to you, though, is I'm going to share with you an article by Brad Thompson. I interviewed him on this channel about a month ago, I think. I am going to read it to you and I'm going to comment as I go. So I hope you'll stick around and listen to the new abolitionism, why education emancipation is the moral imperative of our time, and hopefully you will better understand why I call myself an abolitionist. Before I get into that, though, I would like to ask you to please hit that like button. Consider subscribing to the channel if you like this sort of content. Hit the notification bell to be notified when I make a new video. And please do also consider joining my locals community where we have deeper discussions about these topics and help each other out as we try to reform education for our own children or in general for the country. So without further ado, let's get reading. I begin with my conclusion. The public school system is the most immoral and corrupt institution in the United States of America today, and it should be abolished. It should be abolished for the same reason that chattel slavery was ended in the 19th century. Although different in purpose and in magnitude of harm to its victims, public education, like slavery, is a form of involuntary servitude. The primary difference is that public schools force children to serve the interests of the state rather than those of an individual master. If you were not tuned into that before this year, I hope after the lockouts and the restrictions and all the different virtual education problems, you realize that now that the child is the product of the school, not the client of the school, and you, the parent, really don't have much of a say at all. He continues. These are, to be sure, radical claims, but they are true, and the abolition of public schools is an idea whose time has come. It is time for Americans to re-examine radically and comprehensively the nature and purpose of their disastrously failing public school system and to launch a new abolitionist movement, a movement to liberate tens of millions of children and their parents from this form of bondage. 21st century abolitionists are confronted, however, by a paradoxical fact. Most Americans recognize that something is deeply wrong with the country's elementary and secondary schools, yet they support them like no other institution. Mention the possibility of abolishing the public schools, and most people look at you as though you're crazy. And of course, no politician would ever dare cut spending to our schools and to the kids. As I just said, we're not getting the money to the kids. You do not hear the people appropriating the money and spending the money talking about things they will do for the kids. Oftentimes they talk about how they're going to improve things for teachers, pay teachers more, give teachers better benefits. And now we're hearing about we need to give them childcare and there should be universal basic income for everybody, Medicare for all for everybody, not even for teachers anymore. If you're listening to the teachers unions, we don't often hear the adults involved with the system talking about the children in terms of their own individual achievement or what they need to learn. We hear a lot about how society needs to change around the child or how they're going to get children to help change the society, but not a whole lot about how they, the teachers, are going to help change the lives of the individual children. So even when we talk about cutting spending to the schools for the kids, that's not even where it's going. Another thing to point out is that we keep increasing spending every single year and results keep going down. The scores keep going down. In what other world would you keep spending money, in fact, more money every year, to have worse results? So this is something we really need to think about before we think that, we're being awful to cut the spending. For those who take seriously the idea that our public schools are broken and need to be fixed, the most common solutions include spending more money, raising standards, reducing class size, issuing vouchers, and establishing charter schools. And yet, despite decades of such reforms, our schools only get worse. As I just said, that is a fact. That is not an opinion. They statistically, objectively get worse. And now what we're seeing is not the raising of standards, but the intentional lowering of standards in the name of so-called equity. So there's the justification for lowering the standards, but is that really why we're doing it? Or is it a consequence of failure after trying all kinds of other so-called solutions? Just as antebellum Americans in the North had to be roused, educated, and radicalized on the evils of government-sanctioned involuntary servitude and on the need to abolish slavery, so too 21st century Americans need to be shown the horrors of government-run involuntary schools and persuaded to abolish them. Americans must come to see not only that public school system is failing, but also that it cannot be reformed, because like slavery, it is fundamentally immoral. Abolition will not be achieved anytime soon, but we must work tirelessly step by step to achieve that goal. I'm under no illusions, y'all. I know there's going to be public schooling for a good long while. I might never see this goal achieved. It took 30 years to abolish slavery from the time the abolitionist movement began. There were some people who lived to see the day, but if I'm not there to see it, I hope my kids will be. I watched the Berlin Wall come down. Didn't think that would ever happen. So I've seen some amazing things happen in my lifetime. I believe in this because it is the right thing to do. I don't believe you stop short of doing the right thing because it's hard. And I don't believe you stop short of doing the right thing because lots of people think you're crazy. I know that. I know that people are going to think I'm crazy in part because they think it can't be done, or in part because they just disagree with me about the quality of public schooling. I find that difficult to understand, but I know they're out there. So that's okay. I don't care if you agree with me or disagree with me. I have to be real with you. I have to tell you the truth. If this channel does not support your needs after you hear me tell you all of this, that's fine. YouTube's a big platform, lots of other people to listen to. But if you're interested in learning more about this or even seriously considering these ideas, stick around. And he goes on. The purpose of this essay is to inspire a revolution in the minds of the American people, to shake them of their sentimental attachment to the public school system, and to convince them to unify into an unstoppable movement toward the eventual abolition of public schools. To that end, we will examine what the public schools are, why they are immoral, why they're impractical, and why the only rational moral course of action is to eliminate them. That is also the purpose of this channel, by the way. And along the way, yes, I will try to provide you help navigating the system as it is if you have kids stuck in it. We've just described it as involuntary servitude to the state. I understand that means involuntary. For many of you, there is no way out yet. The coercive nature of public schools. When we talk about the public school system, what exactly are we talking about? What are its defining characteristics and purposes? The public school system is a government-created, government-run monopoly that fills its classrooms with tens of millions of students through compulsory attendance and truancy laws, and that pays for its operations with money coercively taken from American taxpayers. Government bureaucrats dictate what is taught in the classrooms and how it is taught. Government-trained or government-certified teachers run the classrooms where they are required to use government-approved curricula, lesson plans, and textbooks. Not even those anymore. You can't even get your hands on those. That's changed since 2012. The so-called public schools are therefore more properly called government schools, and because their essential characteristic is force, they are properly classified as political institutions. You may not have ever thought of it that way, but I'm hoping through listening to this video and this article, you will begin to think of it that way. It is inherently political what's going on. From the time your children are 5, 6, or 7 years old until they're at least 16, you are legally required to send them to a government-run or government-approved school, accredited, or if you're going to homeschool, you have to jump through government hoops to get permission to educate your own children. So either way, you are having to satisfy the government when it comes to your child's education. In some states today, there are attempts to establish compulsory universal daycare or preschool, which means that the age of compulsion could be lowered to 4, 3, or even 2 years of age. At the other end, some states are considering legislation that would raise the age of compulsory attendance to 18. Support for this idea comes from the top. In his 2012 remarks on the State of the Union, President Barack Obama proposed that every state in the union pass a law requiring students to stay in high school until they graduate or until they turn 18. Because the government forces parents to send their children to government-run or government-approved schools, the government school system is properly classified as a form of conscription. Failure to comply with compulsory attendance laws means you can be harassed and interrogated by the government. Your home can be subject to government inspection, you can be fined and jailed, and your children can be taken from you, evaluated by government psychologists, and put in the care of government social service workers. This is no small thing. If you've ever known anyone who's had this happen to them, you know it is very serious and very real. I actually do know of people who've had this happen to them and their children. It is traumatizing. Very often, it is without cause. So think long and hard about what it means to have your children in loco parentis of the state, and they're more powerful than you are. As an illustration of what compulsory attendance laws mean in practice, consider that in Texas this year, a 17-year-old honor student, Diane Tran, was jailed and fined for missing too much school. This was in 2012. In addition to being a straight-A student, Tran worked 2 jobs during the school year to support 2 dependent siblings. Homeschoolers, too, must comply with government demands. In 2008, Judge H. Walter Krosky of the Second District Court of Appeals in Los Angeles ruled, as Times' Kristen Kloberdan summarizes, that children ages 6 to 18 may be taught only by credentialed teachers in public or private schools or at home by mom and dad, but only if they have a teaching degree. Krosky stated California courts have held that under provisions in the Educational Code, parents do not have a constitutional right to homeschool their children. Furthermore, Kloberdan's reports, the judge held that if instructors teach without credentials, they will be subject to criminal action. Krosky partially reversed his ruling later in 2008, finding, in Kloberdan's words, that as long as parents declare their home to be a private school, they may continue to homeschool their children, even if the parents do not have credentials. However, Krosky continued to hold that parents may homeschool their children only at the indulgence of the legislature, which may grant, alter, or revoke permission to homeschool at its discretion. Think about that. They are your children. You have to ask permission. It is at their discretion for you to educate your own without a teaching degree. Now, considering I have a master's degree in education, although my undergraduate was not in education, I can tell you without hesitation that that degree is not worth the paper it's printed on when it comes to your children. You know more about your children than any certified teacher does or will ever know. And really, that is what it takes. Earlier this year, the New York Department of Children, Youth, and Families accused a homeschooling mother of educational neglect, which is a criminal offense, and with the sanction of a judge, abducted her son and put him in a foster home. What was the mother's crime? Her crime was that the educational bureaucracy had been slow in processing her duly filed paperwork to homeschool her son. Finally, after a protracted court battle, the woman got her son back. Think about all the time he was away from his mother because of paperwork. But only after assuring the government that she had complied with its homeschooling regulations. Although subject to state control, homeschooling in America is at least legal. Not so in Germany, as the Observer reviews. Homeschooling has been illegal in Germany since it was outlawed in 1938. Hitler wanted the Nazi state to have complete control of young minds. Today, there are rare exemptions, such as for children suffering serious illnesses or psychological problems. Legal attempts through the courts, including the European Court of Human Rights, have so far failed to overturn the ban. Let's repeat that. This is a ban put in place by Adolf Hitler. It is still in place to this day. I encourage you to go back and look at the origin of our own public school system and find out where the format for our schools originally come from, but we'll get to that. Today, 75 years later, German education policy is set by Article 7 of the German Constitution, which reads, "The entire school system shall be under the supervision of the state." German law permits private schools, but only when approved and regulated by the state, and when segregation of pupils according to the means of their parents will not be encouraged. There is no difference in theory between the National Socialist Law of 1938 and that which governs education in Germany today. And for many individuals who live under the current law, there is no meaningful difference in practice. For many German homeschooling families, the situation is dire. In Homeschool Germans Flee to UK, the Observer recounts a few disturbing stories such as this one. Klaus Landhall, who moved in January from the Black Forest in Germany to the Isle of Wight with his wife Catherine, said they had no option but to leave their home, friends, and belongings in order to educate their 5 children aged between 3 and 12, legally and without fear. "It feels like persecution," he said. "We had to get to safety to protect our family. We can never go back. If we do, our children will be removed, as the German government says they are property of the state now." Think about that. They are property of the state, your children. That is basically what in loco parentis means. For the 8 hours a day that your children are at school, they are technically the property of the state. The state is responsible for them. We already know, we've heard stories recently of schools transitioning children without telling their parents, taking them to receive medical treatments besides transitioning without notifying their parents. We know that they are violating PPRA virtually every day. We know they violate IDEA laws virtually every day. Your rights are already being violated by your schools, very often because teachers are never taught what they are. And then once you inform them of what they are instructed in many cases to push back on you, not to serve you. In other words, you are the enemy. So while we are not quite to the point of Germany, there are very powerful forces right now in the United States who would love to get there. Think about that. This is the United States of America, and their policy is left over from Nazi Germany. So I'm going to skip this other story about Germany because I think I've made my point about that. All right, moving on. We're going to skip the European stuff. Like I said, I think we understand the point, but let's go to Massachusetts. All right. Attempts have been made throughout American history to pass laws similar to those established in Germany for the purpose of using government force against parents and their children in the realm of education. And these efforts were not limited to assaults on homeschooling. In seeking to require all children to attend government schools, they assaulted private schools as well. Massachusetts led the way with compulsory attendance laws. As Murray Rothbard writes, Massachusetts first imposed compulsory education in 1789. Then, in 1852, established the first comprehensive statewide modern system of compulsory schooling in the United States. In 1862, the state made jailing of habitual truant children mandatory and extended school age to between ages 7 and 16. Think about that. They were jailing truant children. They were jailing children for not attending the state school. Who was harmed? Who was harmed by them being truant in and of itself? Now, if they were out committing crimes while they were truant, it might be a different story. But in and of itself, who was harmed? Okay. In 1866, school attendance was made compulsory for 6 months during the year, but only 6 months. So as bad as this was, it was still only 6 months a year, not 9. Most other states imposed compulsory attendance laws in the 1870s and 1880s. By 1900, court cases has affirmed state enforcement of compulsory attendance laws based on the benefit to the child and the welfare and safety of the state and community. So the supposed benefit to the child and the welfare and safety of the state and community. It's in there. It's in there also from the very beginning. By 1918, compulsory education legislation was passed in all states. So from 1918, and now we are at 2021, that's just over 100 years. So if you were thinking that we have had this nationwide since the very beginning, or that all kids had to attend, no, that's not correct. It's not correct. Also, no teachers' unions during most of this time period. By 1922, the full meaning of the compulsory nature of government education came to fruition in Oregon, where the state legislature passed a law effectively prohibiting the existence of private and parochial schools and compelling all children to attend government schools. Fortunately, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the law in 1925 in a well-known case, Pierce v. Society of Sisters. However, the court upheld the ability of states to compel attendance at government-approved schools, whether public or private. So, that paved the way for homeschoolers to be presumed guilty of abusing their children if they didn't enroll them in a public or a private school, and they had to prove to the state that you were constructively educating your children, not the other way around. To analogize, imagine you had to prove every year to the government that you were feeding your children or clothing them or providing them with some other kind of instruction the government thought they ought to have. It's good to know how to swim, right? It's life-saving, isn't it? Okay, what if you had to prove that specific thing? Just laying the groundwork for that there is that precedent, opens the door for them to tell parents all kinds of things they have to do when raising their children. Since that ruling, private schools have been legal in all states in America, but a movement to regulate or even ban all forms of private education, including independent, religious, and homeschools, has gained ground in recent years, with advocates in the media, America's law and ed schools, and teachers' unions. Homeschooling is on the front lines of these attacks. For Robin L. West, a professor at the Georgetown University Law Center, the recriminalization of homeschooling is not a politically viable option today, but only because homeschooling is such an entrenched practice. So, in lieu of recriminalizing homeschooling, she supports government regulation of what is taught in the privacy of the home. Curricular regulation, West writes, would give the state the authority to ensure that students are exposed to diverse and more liberal ways of life. And Kristen Rawls, a popular journalist writing for Salon, does not believe the answer is to end homeschooling altogether, nor does she think it necessary to imprison homeschooling parents, but she does advocate heavily regulating home education, including the creation of a government homeschool watch list. This was in 2012, 2013 that this was written. Do you think this has changed, abated, or in any way moved in the direction of parents since then? I'm going to go with no. So think about that for a second. I want the state to decide what your children are exposed to. You can't be trusted. You might teach them wrong think. And we need to have a homeschool watch list and govern what you're teaching in the privacy of your own home. How different is that really from compelled speech? It's not at all. So, really unconstitutional stuff they're advocating for with a straight face. Catherine J. Ross, a professor at George Washington University Law School, argues that a liberal society should not tolerate the inculcation of absolutist views that undermine toleration of difference. Interesting, considering that's exactly what's going on in our schools right now. The inculcation of absolutist views that undermine toleration of difference. Right? Different ideas are not welcome. There is only the way, the truth, and the light of woke. And so the state can and should limit the ability of intolerant homeschoolers to inculcate hostility to difference in their children, at least during the portion of the day they claim to devote to satisfying the compulsory schooling requirement. Ross's explicit goal is for the state to regulate those homeschooling parents who believe in an absolute truth. This would be clamping down on the freedom of religion, by the way, as well as compelled speech. Such views, she writes, have no place in America. Interesting. Such views have no place in America? They're present in every church and mosque and synagogue. And right now, they're present in every university as well. So if they have no place in America, they seem to have a lot of places in America, as it should be, because we don't regulate thought. Apparently, Ross is oblivious to the fact that her condemnation of other people's absolutist views is itself absolutist. Not to mention the fact that she's willing to use the coercion of the state to support her absolutism. Yes, hypocrisy and the, iron law of woke projection. Likewise, Professor Kimberly A. Urako of Northwestern University Law School has argued that constitutional and political limits must be placed on homeschooling parents who teach their children idiosyncratic and illiberal beliefs and values. Professor Martha Albertson Feynman of Emory University Law School has openly proposed that public education in America should be mandatory and universal, that parents should be permitted only to supplement but never supplant the public institutions where the basic and fundamental lesson would be taught and experienced by all American children. We must struggle together to define ourselves both as a collective and as individuals. Does that sound like a person who supports individual liberty, the Bill of Rights, the values that made this country America in the first place? Not to me. None of the aforementioned critics of homeschooling has specified, at least not yet, what punishments they would advocate for people who resist their decrees, and people would. I would be one of them. The other thing they don't really do is show any evidence in support of their plan as far as how it would be better for the children. It definitely would be better for the state. Certainly, if you round up all the kids and mandate they go to the same schools directed by the government, with the curriculum chosen by the government, with teachers trained and hired by the government and paid by the government, with dollars, coercively taken from the population, I think it definitely would tend to favor the state's interests. But I don't hear anything in there about the students. So is it any wonder that we have a system that doesn't really care about what's going on with the students when you have people like that advocating for it? Government schools are tools of indoctrination. Again, written in 2012. And here we are. I think most of us in 2012, I knew they already were. Many of you probably did not until recently. He knew it. For almost 250 years, education in Britain's North American colonies and then in the United States of America was almost entirely private. Parents had the freedom to choose the education, ideas, and values that they wanted for their children. By contrast, America's experiment with universal compulsory education, which began in earnest in the 1850s and picked up in the postbellum period, was explicitly based on the authoritarian Prussian model. That's Germany. In 1836, for instance, Calvin E. Stowe of Ohio, one of America's leading education reformers, hailed the Prussian system of compulsory education. In his book, The Prussian System of Public Instruction and Its Applicability to the United States, he urged America to adopt the Prussian model. America began to follow his advice in just a few years. Originally, the purpose of America's new Prussianized education system was twofold. First, to elevate and promote the interests of the state as the nation's primary vehicle for establishing moral virtue and political order. Second, to indoctrinate each new generation of children into being obedient and subservient subjects of the state. This view of government schooling was best summed up by the philosopher Johann Fichte, who wrote that the German schools must fashion the student and fashion him in such a way that he simply cannot will otherwise than you wish him to will. Does that sound American to you? Does that sound like education for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Or does that sound like education for service to the state? And there it is, explicit: to indoctrinate each new generation of children into being obedient and subservient subjects of the state, which means you should not have enough skill to be able to do for yourself. You should be subservient and dependent on the state. Under this Americanized Prussian model, America's government bureaucrats and teachers were to create a system that would foster collective obedience to those in power. Over the course of the past 150 years, the specific goals of the state have changed marginally with changing administrations, but the general goal of the government schools has remained the same: to indoctrinate children and mold them to the goals of the state. The purpose of government education, wrote Edward Ross, a prominent American sociologist and education theorist, is, quote, to collect little plastic lumps of human dough from private households and shape them on the social kneading board. This was a prominent American sociologist, an education theorist. These are the kind of people up in the academy, in the cathedral, telling teachers what their job is. I was taught in graduate school that teaching was a political act. I was taught that. It definitely gave me chills. Did not go into teaching for that reason. The goal of government schools is not to serve children by teaching them to think and acquire important knowledge, but to serve the state by forcing children to conform to its will. The U.S. Bureau of Education made this point clear in 1914. Let me repeat that. The U.S. Bureau of Education made the point clear in 1914. And do not mistake this for the Federal Department of Education. Different animal entirely. The public schools exist primarily for the benefit of the state rather than for the benefit of the individual. More recently, William H. Sewell, a professor of education at the University of Virginia, defended government schooling by stating, each child belongs to the state. Did you know that, Mom and Dad? That people today believe that? Education professors believe that? Bet you didn't know that. What are the implications and realities of a school system that regards children as belonging to the state and holds the purpose of schools as instilling obedience? Consider a recent example from New Jersey, where a school required its children to recite the Pledge of Allegiance not to the flag of the United States, but to the school itself and to its teachers. Students were told to pledge their allegiance to the Marlborough Township School District and to the teachers who help us learn all that we need to know for the future. That was reported by Fox News. FoxNews.com reports that after receiving criticism for this, the school opted to rewrite the pledge as a school song instead. So much better. Now it's a song. As though it makes any difference whether the propaganda is spoken or sung. One consequence of a system in which government schools push state-sanctioned ideas and values on children is that the system invites ideological groups to pursue political power in order to force their particular ideology on the community, the state, or the nation as a whole. I'm going to stop there, and now I want you to think about critical theory, all the critical pedagogies, CRT, critical social justice, culturally responsive education, social emotional learning. Starting to catch on? So what do you think groups like teachers' unions are? They're political action committees. What do you think they want to do? They want to pursue political power in order to force that ideology on the children, which will then in turn support more political power. And it's a circle, isn't it? Government schooling enables those who control the state to force their political views on those who do not. As a result, liberals in Kansas rightly fear the conservatives in power will use the government education system to support a religious agenda, and conservatives in Massachusetts rightly fear that liberals in power will use the school to promote a leftist agenda. Parents who want their kids to get a good education in math, science, history, and literature rightly fear both. They no more want their 6-year-olds being forced to memorize the 10 Commandments in school than they want them being forced to read Heather Has Two Mommies. Parents, of course, are properly free to introduce their children to such subjects, but the government has no business pushing religious or sexual preferences on students, or gender ideology, or critical race theory, or any number of other things that really ought to just be confined to the private realm. It is clearly a violation of rights for the government to force secular parents to send their children to schools that teach them the world was made in 7 days, that snakes can talk, that a virgin gave birth, that a man walked on water, or the like. And it is likewise a violation of rights for the government to force religious parents to send their children to schools that teach them to worship Mother Earth, to put condoms on cucumbers, to reject the Bible but enjoy the Quran, and to regard American society as inherently racist, sexist, classist, and homophobic. The problem here is not that schools are teaching values. No education, whether it is government, private, parochial, or homeschooling, can escape the teaching of values. The problem is that the values being taught in government schools are chosen not by the parents, but by the state. And before you say, well, if they're going to teach values, then how could you, what should they teach? How about the universal values that are documented in our founding documents? We do have them written down, right? Remember, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Even if you want to go with the Bill of Rights. There are some universal values that each individual is endowed by their whatever creator, nature, whatever you want to call it, with certain inalienable rights. How about those? Those are values too. How about simple things like hard work pays off, or maybe it doesn't pay off, but it's definitely a value. You should try. Merit matters. Things like that. These are universal values. The role parents play in the system of government education is minimal to non-existent. Parents today have virtually no control over the ideas or values taught at the school to which their children have been assigned by the government. Over the past 150 years, the government has acquired the authority to teach children values that were once the exclusive domain of mothers and fathers. It has done so on the supposition that it knows better than parents how to bring up their children and which values they should embrace. Well, if they think they own your children, why wouldn't they think that? If you keep sending your kids, why wouldn't they think that? If you actually cave when teachers and administrators say, you don't know, you're not a teacher, you don't have a degree, you don't have a certificate. By the way, that's a logical fallacy and appeal to authority. But if you don't know what a logical fallacy is, because guess what? The government school never taught it to you because they don't want you to know what it is, so they can continue to use non-arguments to combat your pushback when you want to defend your own kids. What good's it going to do you? Although in some school districts, parents are given a token voice in school affairs, even this small role is granted by permission rather than by right. The view of government authorities and educators on this matter is that parents are an unenlightened, harmful influence on children during the formative years of their development. As Judge Archibald Douglas Murphy, founder of the government school system in North Carolina, wrote in 1816, the government must educate children in the virtues of subordination and obedience because parents know not how to instruct them. The state, in the warmth of her affection and solicitude for their welfare, must take the charge of those children and place them in school where their minds can be enlightened and their hearts can be trained to virtue. Did you know that? Did you know any of these things? I did, of course. I've researched this. But did you, gentle listener, know that at one time your government and your schools thought that of you? And they still do. Since Murphy's time, leaders of the government school establishment have always viewed parents not as clients whose needs and values were to be respected and catered to, but as recalcitrant reactionaries standing in the way of genuine reform. In 1864, the state superintendent of public instruction for California stated unequivocally the role that the state should play in the education of children. 1864. The child should be taught to consider his instructor in many respects superior to the parent in point of authority. The vulgar impression that parents have a legal right to dictate to teachers is entirely erroneous. To enforce the point, California progressives even denied parents the right to criticize government school teachers. The California Penal Code declared every parent, guardian, or other person who upbraids, insults, or abuses any teacher of the public schools in the presence or hearing of a pupil thereof is guilty of a misdemeanor. So if you were under the impression that the schools belong to you and that they serve you and that your goal now is to take them back, you never had them. They weren't yours to begin with. The goal of government schooling is and has always been social reconstruction for the purpose of advancing the ideological agenda of those in power. This means that the teacher, the school, and ultimately the state must assume control of the child in order to re-educate him and to break him from the influence of recalcitrant and ignorant parents who almost always teach the wrong ideas and values. Horace Mann, the 19th century godfather of American government schooling, summed up the anti-parent premise of state-run education in these terms. We who are engaged in the sacred cause of education are entitled to look upon all parents as having given hostages to our cause. So if in the past year you thought your children were being held hostage and that it was kind of new, it was like a new thing, welcome to reality. It has always been the case. You just didn't necessarily see it. Backed by the state's monopoly on coercive force, the government schools in effect seize children from their parents, then indoctrinate them with the government-mandated curriculum. What parents want for their children is beside the point. As the Wisconsin Teachers Association declared in 1865, your children are the property of the state. On the basis of these related premises, government schooling takes away from parents the enormous responsibility of providing their children with an education and transfers that responsibility to the state. And then we have people like a commenter today in one of my videos saying, I think American parents are so irresponsible and they don't take care of their children's education. Well, what do you expect? They've been relieved of that responsibility for 100 years. The government decides which schools children will attend, what and how they will be taught, and who they will associate with for several hours a day. The parent's only responsibility is to ensure the child is delivered to the school on time every day. If they should fail in that responsibility, the child is declared truant. And in most states, the parent is subject to fine and or imprisonment. The schools have become surrogate parents concerned with child rearing, not through default, as they typically argue, but by design. They blame parents too. Well, it's not our fault. Parents don't do their job. No, this was by design. If parents aren't doing the job, it's because you've relieved them of the responsibility to do the job. And they never really learned how to do it because they didn't see their parents doing it. In California, for example, a federal appellate judge ruled in 2005 that the government school system has the absolute authority and right to educate children about whatever it wants, including matters dealing with sex. In the case of Fields v. Palmdale School District, the court invoked the doctrine of parens patriae, i.e., the country as parent, which says that the government has the authority to do anything reasonably related to its educational mission. According to Judge Stephen Reinhart, there is no fundamental right of parents to be exclusive provider of information regarding sexual matters to their children. Ultimately, the court wrote, parents' right to control the upbringing of their children does not extend beyond the threshold of the school door. The court continued, stipulating that once a parent puts a child in a government school, something many parents must do given compulsory schooling laws, the taxes they are forced to pay for public schools, and their inability to pay for education twice, the parents' fundamental right to control the education of their children is, at the least, substantially diminished. Today, what we hear is forfeited. Well, you gave them to us and you did this, and you shouldn't complain. The same year Judge Reinhart issued his California ruling, David Parker, a Massachusetts father of a 5-year-old boy, was arrested, handcuffed, thrown in jail for a night, and fined after he went to his son's school objecting to his child being forced to read and discuss the book Who's in a Family, a book promoting same-sex marriage. Parker was arrested for trespassing after refusing to leave the school until it honored his requests. Parker sought merely to arrange an opt-out for his son, but his efforts were in vain. The following year, Parker filed a federal civil rights lawsuit in order to defend his right to have some control over his son's education. Parker's lawsuit claimed the school had intruded upon, impaired, and invaded his substantive due process rights under the 4th, 5th, and 14th Amendments in 3 ways. First, by violating his rights as a parent and guardian to direct the moral upbringing of his children. Second, by violating his familial privacy rights. And third, by violating his right to the free exercise of his religion. Federal court judges in the Parker case eventually ruled that parents have no right to interfere with the authority of the government schools to educate children on whatever topics they please. No right to interfere. So if you're out there thinking like, we have a right to tell them to stop teaching CRT, no, you do not. Given that parents are forbidden from determining what subjects their children will study in school or how they will be taught, given that these matters are fully in the hands of government educators, what ideas and values are these educators teaching American children? Over the past several decades, and remember, this is pre-CRT. This is before everything you've learned about in the last year that you're hot and bothered by. A well-organized movement has revolutionized the curricula and culture of the nation's government schools. Its aim is to eradicate the prejudices and attitudes children learn from their families with regard to issues of race, class, the environment, gender, sexual orientation, and so on. These are the obsessions of the government schools. Officially, the schools claim to teach no moral values per se, but that claim is patently contradicted by the fact that they constantly push diversity, tolerance, and moral relativism. Such values are intended to strip the children of any standards or principles they may have previously embraced, so the teachers can replace them with the values of the cultural left: egalitarianism, what we now call equity, multiculturalism, feminism, community service, environmentalism, and social justice. The primary function of teachers is no longer to be the transmitters of knowledge, but to serve as agents of social change. Again, might I remind you, this was written 2012, 2013. Here we are, almost 10 years later. America's leading teacher training institutions, teachers' unions, and textbook publishers push a radical new left Marxist feminist egalitarian ideology we now know as critical justice or critical theory. One could write a book on this topic alone, so let us consider just a few examples that have been in the news in recent years. Now, I'm not even going to go through these because y'all are up to date on what's been going on with all these theories and all this stuff. I don't even need to read this, right? So I'm going to skip all of it, all right? And just go straight to further atrocities because you know what kinds of ideas they've been teaching just that you've been made aware of already in the past year. 2012. Okay, it started a long time ago. Further atrocities in government schools. In addition to indoctrinating students in multiculturalism, social justice, and environmentalism, government schools are probing into the private lives of children and their parents. I've been talking about this a lot on this channel lately. The violations of PPRA, the prying in with these questionnaires about your private life and then documenting it electronically and selling that data to third parties without your permission or knowledge. Okay? For instance, in a New Jersey elementary school, students were asked on one of their standardized tests to reveal a secret about their lives and explain why it was hard to keep. Regardless of whether this was an act of innocent stupidity or malicious calculation on the part of New Jersey school officials, the fact remains that this kind of psychological intrusion into the lives of children has the effect of turning them into stooges for the state. When government school officials gather private information from students, what is to stop them from using such information against the children or their parents? Nothing. Nothing's to stop them. And they will. And they have. Suppose teachers learn that a given student's parents refuse to recycle, or they cook with trans fats, or they deny global warming or own guns, or attend Tea Party events, or January 6th, or voted the wrong way, or are patriotic, which we now hear is extremist, apparently. Or maybe you buy big gulps and they don't want you to do that. Whatever it is, whatever kind of a list it could be put on if you ask a little 6 or 7-year-old, like, does anyone in your family do that? Mm-hmm. They're not supposed to ask these questions. Okay. And there are laws, like I said, PPRA, they are violated every day. They violate them. They're invulnerable. They know they are because you, the parent, have to know they're doing it. And that means you have to get it out of your kid first. Good luck. We knew about these things in the past year because it was coming into our living rooms. I mean, I knew about before then because my kids did tell me, but not everybody's kids do. In addition to placing children in the service of the state, government schools can, and in some ways do, turn teachers into spies for the state. In the Canadian province of Ontario, a father was arrested in strip search recently, his home ransacked by police, and his wife and children taken into police custody and interviewed by Family and Children's Services, all because the man's 4-year-old daughter drew a picture in her kindergarten class of her father holding a gun. Yeah. Back in America, the focus is less on parents and guns and more on children and sex. And now, of course, again on parents and guns because of January 6th. Not only do many government school teachers mine their students for personal information about themselves and their families, many government schools are outfitted with barbed wire, metal detectors, locked doors, time bells that go off at regular intervals, closed-circuit television monitors, linked directly to local police stations, armed guards, bomb-sniffing dogs, protocols for strip searches. And this was back again in 2012, okay? And now what they've done is they want to get rid of all of that, but they don't have a plan in place to improve discipline, improve safety for your child in the school. So now we get rid of all these scary looking things that make it look obviously like a prison, but it really hasn't changed the social dynamics, the socialization within the building, especially in urban schools. So they're more dangerous than ever for everyone, teachers included. Okay. Let's see. Oh, here, this is interesting. At one school in a district in Texas, students have been expelled for not wearing their government-issued microchipped embedded ID cards, the purpose of which is to monitor their whereabouts at all times while in the school. Does that bear any resemblance to a prison? Okay. And then there are the drugs. Starting in the 1980s and 1990s, psychologists, counselors, and teachers working in government schools began diagnosing young boys with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder in alarming numbers and then pressuring parents and doctors to have them medicated. Okay, so I'm going to skip this. You know about this. You now know about puberty blockers that are being, given to children without their parents' knowledge. It's being kept secret and, bad things are happening. Okay? Let's see. Teachers and government officials have even threatened to send boys to special education facilities if their parents refuse to medicate them. That has happened in American history. By 2004, the coerced drugging of American children by the government became so bad that President George W. Bush signed into law the Prohibition on Mandatory Medication Amendment, which bans government schools from forcing parents to drug their children for classroom or behavioral problems. When politicians start banning government bureaucrats from immoral behavior, you know the situation must be very bad indeed. And I want to mention that because you might hear that and say, see, people are trying to do good things and trying to pass laws that reform things, like I said, like PPRA, except they don't really work because, as I said, there's nobody out there enforcing them except parents. So first you have to know about it. Now this one, obviously they can't mandate you take a drug. So they're just not going to do that anymore. But there are kids being given drugs without your consent. They're not mandating that you transition your kid. They're just going to go ahead and do it without your permission and knowledge. And I'm hearing even about some kids who are being given these kind of psychoactive drugs without the parental knowledge. So they can't mandate it, but they're just going to go do it behind your back because they're busy changing the laws around consent. And they're saying that once the child is in the custody of the school, the child can consent to all kinds of medical treatment. When they're in your care or in the care of a babysitter or somebody that you have specifically chosen, they can't get their ears pierced. They can't get a tooth pulled. They can't do anything without your written consent or, presence. But the school can do it. Not only are America's government schools corrupt and immoral for all the foregoing reasons, they're also inconsequently failing academically. Imagine that, what we had to go through before I got to also failing academically. So they're indoctrinating your kids. They're coming between parents and kids. They're assuming ownership of your child. They're possibly medicating and transitioning your child to sterilizing them effectively without your knowledge. And they reserve the right to teach any ideas they want, and you have no say in it. Oh, and P.S., they're not teaching them to read and not teaching them to do math. So American students know less and less. The nation's report card proves it. Okay? In history, for instance, only 20% of U.S. fourth graders, this is in 2012, 17% of eighth graders, and 12% of 12th graders who took the 2010 National Assessment of Educational Progress exams were deemed proficient or advanced in their knowledge of the subject of history, their nation's own history. How do you preserve your rights if you don't even know what they are? Okay, that's partly civics, but also just knowing where they come from is important. More than 50% of high school seniors posted scores at the lowest level, below basic, and only 35% of fourth graders knew the purpose of the Declaration of Independence. I have met high school seniors who don't know what it is today. According to a recent survey, 42% of Americans think Karl Marx's communist slogan, "From each according to his ability to each according to his needs," is to be found in one of America's founding documents. So they don't even understand what it means. But they've memorized it. I wonder why, or I wonder how. In a 2002 survey on geographic literacy conducted in nine nations, American students scored next to last. They don't even know the shape of the world that they live in, okay? American students' science test scores are equally abysmal. P.S. last year, below 25%. Here it says 2/3 of U.S. fourth graders, 70% of eighth graders, and 79% of 12th graders failed to show science proficiency. Nothing has changed since 2009. Zero improvement. We've actually gone down a little bit. And yet, how much more money have we spent? Likewise, in math, in 2007, 61% of U.S. fourth graders and 66% of eighth graders scored below the proficient level on the test. On international mathematics exams, American students typically finish close to the bottom of world rankings. We're the people who put people on the moon and won 2 world wars. And you might say, yeah, we had public schools then. Yeah, we did. Here's what we didn't have: a federal Department of Education or teachers unions nationalized like we do now. Yeah, so there is that. From a historical perspective, today's schools could not hold a candle to those of the 19th century. In 1885, the following math question was on admissions test for 8th grade students applying to Jersey City High School. Find the sum and difference of 3x minus 4ay plus 7cd, etc. By contrast, here is a sample equation from the 1998 Ohio 9th grade mathematics proficiency test about how long is a new standard size pencil. That's in 1998. Can you imagine where we are now? And then there are the reading scores. I don't even need to go through this. Y'all know. If you pay any attention to this channel or anything, you know the reading scores are terrible. The result of the decline and fall of American education is summed up in a 2007 newspaper headline: American kids dumber than dirt. They're not really dumb. They're actually quite bright. They're just ignorant, completely ignorant, which is very dangerous. It's dangerous because we've told them now for 15 or 20 years that they're special, that their every opinion is important and relevant and valid, despite the fact that they don't know anything. They don't know the shape of the world. They don't know their history. They don't know how the government is organized. They don't know their rights. They don't know anything. Okay? As he says, American kids are, of course, not less intelligent than they've ever been, but they do know less than ever before. And the students are not alone in their ignorance. Many of their teachers, unsurprisingly, are ignorant too. In Illinois, 78% of prospective teachers failed an 11th grade level competency test administered in 2010. Okay? I could go on reading all of this, but the statistics are really dismal. Okay? As if the flunking of academic performance of American students and teachers were not bad enough, our government schools are also in a state of moral anarchy, from drug and alcohol abuse to sexual nihilism to bullying to mass murder. If it is bad for life and happiness, it can be found in the government schools. A recent survey by the National Center on Addiction and Substance Abuse, and again, 2012, found that 17% of American high school students, roughly 2.8 million teenagers, use drugs at school. At school. My own children reported the same when they were in school. And then this goes on and on as well. Sexual abuse that's going on in schools, we know all about that. And I'm just going to skip ahead to, public safety, sex in school. It just goes on and on. All right. Now to the cost. I do want to spend a little time on this. Okay. The United States spends more on education than any other nation in the world, but with shockingly poor results. In 2003, a long time ago, the United States spent an average of $10,240 per pupil. I think it's now up to like $16,000 per pupil. While 25 other industrialized nations spent on average $6,361, and students from these other nations typically score better on international tests than do American students. What's the difference? Is that they are using better methods. So it's not that they're, not government schools, because they have similar problems in that realm, but they're at least getting the academics done. At least they're not afraid for their population to know things. For whatever reason, our schools do not want our children to know things, which is downright bizarre. And that is why I think the system goes from being, immoral and unethical to downright evil. Because they know they're doing it. If they're planning to do it, I can't prove, but they do know that they are doing it. The results have been bad for enough years that they know it is at this point intentional. The private schools spend way less, $37.50 in a Catholic school, for example. Finally, the case for abolition is clear. America's government school system is immoral, impractical, and unfixable. It is immoral because it's coercive, because it forces parents to submit their children to government-sanctioned educators, government-sanctioned curricula, and the whims of government bureaucrats, and because it forces Americans to fund its immoral operations at the point of a gun. The government school system is impractical in that it fails to educate children, and it fails to do so by design. Its goal is not and never has been to educate children. Its goal is to create obedient citizens who will serve the state. And because the government school system is by its very nature immoral and impractical, it cannot be reformed. It must be abolished. The task before us is daunting, but that is no excuse. Who would have thought in 1830, with the notable exception of one man, William Lloyd Garrison, that slavery could be abolished in America? Garrison and his fellow followers ultimately succeeded because they were right on principle. They knew it and they proceeded accordingly. We who recognize that the government schools are fundamentally immoral and impractical must take the same principled course with respect to our cause. We must be the new abolitionists. We must identify ourselves as such. We must unabashedly speak the truth, and we must uncompromisingly call for ending government schools. Part and parcel of our principled approach must be the wholesale rejection of conservative demands for prudence, demands that the government school not be abolished but rather reformed. Nonsense. You cannot reform that which is fundamentally corrupt. Remember why they were instituted, what the purpose of them was to begin with, and what model they followed, the Prussian model. How do you reform that? Even Germany, that got rid of Nazism, retained the same format of school. So if it was conceived immorally, it's going to stay that way. You cannot fix that. Conservatives, not to mention leftists, will attempt to smear us as extremists every day, as firebrands, as incendiaries. Good. We will answer that we are extremists for what is morally right and educationally practical. We will explain that because our position is right in theory, it will also work in practice. We will explain that the only approach deserving of the term prudent is the approach based on sound moral principles and the actual facts on the ground. William Lloyd Garrison and the other original abolitionists were extremists, firebrands, and incendiaries, and they were called far worse than imprudent for taking their principled stand. Yet they courageously and proudly stood and said, I am an abolitionist. Do we lack their courage and pride, or will we stand with them and say, I too am an abolitionist? That is the question with which we are faced. I've made my choice. I'm an abolitionist. As am I. So I hope you better understand now where I stand on this issue, why I call myself an abolitionist right up front. And as I said, you needn't agree with me. It still, for the time being, is a free country, and you can have whatever opinion you want. You can think that it can be reformed. That is your right. But it is my right to speak out forcefully and stick to my principles, and I'm going to do that. And if you think that makes me an extremist, so be it. I can take that heat. As always, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. I hope you will like, share, comment, and subscribe. That's the video.